let's pause there on the just like kind of trying to capture the public perception of what these watches are and what people might think about them, and think about it from a little more of a data driven standpoint. So what we can talk about actually is some data that we have for both two-tone watches being sold in the primary market. So just based off of Swiss industry export numbers, and then use some of our own data to talk about how two-tone watches seem to be doing on the secondary market or the pre-owned market. Charles, do you want to walk us through some of the numbers?
Yeah, so this is from the FHS. It's basically the Swiss watch industry like official publication, of how they're doing. The website is fhs.swiss, and what we're looking at is the export of Swiss watches by case material historically, and so they publish data sort of every 5 years, going back from 2000. And then since 2018, they have data for every single year. We're looking at specifically a breakdown of what they call precious metal, steel, and bimetallic watches. So bimetallic, we're assuming would be, makes sense, would be two-tone. And so what we see is that both in terms of the percentage of total units produced, as well as the percentage of export value, two-tone watches are actually seeing increase on both fronts between the year 2000 and the year 2021. So the number of units went from 867,000 to 1.1 million over that 21-year period. And then the exports went from 1.5 million, roughly, CHF to 3.6 million. And also just proportionally, of the total Swiss exports, it's also up as well. So it's up both numerically and proportionally to the whole. And when we first saw this was very, very surprising to us because, as collectors, we just spent a couple minutes talking about, the collector sentiment. It was not apparent to us that, the situation, at least on the primary market in terms of exports and watches being sold new, was what it was. We expected, probably two-tone to remain flat or maybe, even drop off. I would not have been surprised if it dropped off significantly, but it seems like on the primary market, that's not the case.
I would have expected these numbers to stay steady before we looked them up. And in fact, this is, it's interesting at this juncture to point out that like we thought the original title for this episode could be "Is Two-Tone Making a Comeback?" And we started getting pedantic about what it meant to come back. And so we, we pivoted away from that a little bit. But this really is showing that two-tone, based on the numbers, there's more of them being made at a higher average value, and they are becoming increasingly more popular within the overall proportions of different types of watches when segmented by case material. So yeah, the short answer is two-tone does seem to be making a comeback, at least as far as the primary market outlook is concerned. But this, of course, is just the primary market outlook, and then we have to caveat it with saying that this is just one source, and that source is Swiss. We think in this instance that it can do a pretty decent job of standing in for global numbers. But how would this compare if we moved on to talk about the secondary market? I think the situation looks more in line with what we think the overall perception is.
Right. And, if you're looking at it purely from a primary market perception, like your answer would be, like you said, when we were when we were preparing for this episode, like, two-tone was never gone. It's not coming back because it was never gone to begin with. It's consistently, more prevalent today than it is 20 years ago. Right. But certainly in the, enthusiast audience, right? Because we have to keep in mind, these are overall export numbers, and only a portion of watches being bought are being bought by enthusiasts, and perhaps that portion is more represented in the secondary market, but that is something that we have to keep in mind. So moving on to the secondary market, this is much more, I think, in line with what we had just discussed as the public perception. And I have a few examples of specific watches that I want to share. And it was actually in researching these watches that I sort of, got the idea for this episode and this, very interesting talking point of, what's going on in the two-tone market. And that observation is that, there are certain very, very popular watches out there where the two-tone variant is actually cheaper than the steel variant on the secondary market. And that was just like mind-blowing to me because, I would sure like, maybe proportionally like steel watches are up more or, more above retail than two-tone watches. But like for a steel watch to actually be more expensive than the two-tone variant, I think, is sort of a clear demonstration that there's value, there's relative value to be found on the market by looking at two-tone. I have a couple of examples here. The first is the Rolex Skydweller and the reference 326933 in two-tone. We say that this watch has a market average of about $24,000, and it is a little bit different depending on whether you get the Oyster or the Jubilee bracelet and then the dial color. But compared to the steel variant, the reference 326934, if you want to compare like, the blue dial steel variant on an Oyster bracelet, we say is like, 35,000 compared to, 24,000 for the two tone. Let's say like, or 23,000, we say like with the black dial, right? Like it is a massive, massive discrepancy. And even if you don't account for the dial, even if you look at the same dial, right? The black dial two tone with Oyster bracelet is 23,000. The black dial two tone the black dial steel with Oyster bracelet is about 25,000, right? 24,700 is what we say. I mean, like, again, that just blew my mind. Like, you can get the more luxurious case material and a better value. And I think that's how much two tones are being overlooked. I have a second example of this happening with the Royal Oak 15450. For the 15450 two-tone, it's the 15450 SR reference. They only make a white dial variant, I believe. And the market average that we say for the two-tone variant is about $40,000. And then if you look at the white dial 15450 in steel, reference 15450 ST, then what we say is that the market average is, again, like, 41,000, 40,000. It's sort of right in line or slightly above the two-tone variant.
I just want to acknowledge here for a second. Again, I feel like we touch on this maybe every episode, but like our perception of where we think the value lies in the market may not be shared by everyone. So, and in fact, it is not shared by everyone, as evidenced by market averages. The fact that simpler watches can cost more than their complicated counterparts, or the fact that steel watches can cost more than their precious metal counterparts or partly precious metal counterparts, doesn't make sense to us.
And I'm not sure like how much, people are paying attention to this. Like, I'm not sure. I don't feel like this is what the observation that we made is like very well known.